Uh,
Yeah.
I think we read a week ago, Monday, it was an editorial, or 2 weeks ago today, I guess, there was an editorial that got it right.
Thank you. My name is Bill Alford, and I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's program on behalf of the Center for International Affairs, the East Asian Legal Studies program of the Law School, the Friends of Burma of Harvard, the Kennedy School of Government's International Development Professional Interest Council, and the Edward S. Mason Program in Public Policy and Management. All these different programs are involved in co-sponsoring this afternoon's event. And I'm delighted to be able to welcome our distinguished panelists and other guests to this activity. Now, we are holding today's program to mark the 20th anniversary of the all too early passing of Uthan, and in the course of doing this to honor his many and enduring accomplishments. Uthan was an extraordinary individual who let his accomplishments speak very much for themselves. By all accounts, he was a quiet and gentle man of deep conviction who each day began life with a period of meditation, as he put it, in order to, quote, eliminate all hatred, all anger, all bitterness from my being, and to think on what is good in life, good thoughts and good deeds. He also found time to belong to no fewer than 6 different book clubs while Secretary General of the UN, and to continue his own writing. Perhaps this is why he succeeded so brilliantly in his tenure as Secretary General of the UN, this dimension of contemplation and reflectiveness. Before that, as you all know, had been instrumental in the securing of independence for Burma and the establishment of independent government thereafter. During his decade at the UN, he presided over what may well have been the most extraordinarily turbulent period in that organization's life. That, after all, was a decade marked by the Congo peacekeeping missions, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the beginnings of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, the '67 Middle East War, the fight over PRC admission to the UN, Indian-Pakistani disputes, and a variety of internal administrative and financial questions inside the UN itself. And he handled all this with great skill and depthness diplomatically and intellectually. Indeed, his legacy is one that has enriched all of us in many ways, visible and as yet unseen. As then President Gerald Ford said at the time of the Secretary General's death, Uthan's loyalty was not to any one power or ethnic bloc, but to all of humanity. Now, as someone able to rise above partisan or ethnic groupings, Uthan no doubt would have been quite deeply saddened to have seen the turn of events in his beloved Burma over the past 2 decades since his death. Under the State Law and Order Restoration Council, SLORC, which we will hear more of today, ethnic strife between Burmese and other minority nationalities living in Burma has intensified. Human rights abuses, as we'll hear of, are legion, and whereas Burma was once the rice bowl for Asia, known as the rice bowl of Asia, today some 16 million of the 42 million people living in Burma are living below the level of poverty. We are fortunate today, as we look to some of these problems and other issues confronting Burma, to have with us a most talented panel. I must thank, in particular, Dr. Francis Xiao, who has been one of the many people involved in organizing this on behalf of the Friends of Burma, an organization devoted, among other activities, to exploring the history, culture, and current political and human rights circumstances of Burma. He has organized, along with many others whose time does not permit me fully to identify, a panel that not only reflects the U.S. views, but more importantly, perhaps, the views of ASEAN countries and of scholars studying Burma and Uthan's life in particular. To introduce our panel members and to lead our discussion today, we are in the able hands of Carol Grodzins, who, as many of you know, is the skilled administrator of the Mason Fellows Program. She has an extraordinary background, educated at the University of Illinois, here at Harvard, as well with a nursing degree from the Mass General Hospital, and speaks Indonesian, Malaysian, Russian, and probably a number of other languages I'm not recalling at the moment, and has a quite rich experience working in Malaysia in primary education, and here in the U.S. in a number of projects to do with development and food policy. So at this point, I'd like to turn the floor over to Carol. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Edward S. Mason Program in Public Policy and Management, a joint program between Harvard Institute for International Development and the Kennedy School of Government. The Mason Program since 1958 has invited approximately 60 mid-career public officials from developing countries to come to Harvard for a year of intense study in policy and leadership. I would also like to thank Dr. Francis Xiao, who has worked with me very hard to present this afternoon's seminar, and Elena Diaz-Balelo from the Mason Program Office. And our co-sponsors, as Bill said, included the Friends of Burma at Harvard, the East Asian Legal Studies Program at Harvard Law School, the International Development Professional Interest Council, which is a student organization at the Kennedy School, and the Center for International Affairs, and also through a generous grant from the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in New York. Why we're having this seminar is an interesting story. Last spring, I was at dinner at the Center for International Affairs and had the wonderful pleasure of meeting Mrs. A.A. Tant and her husband Tin Mint Oo. And at that time, I was saying that in our Mason program, since 1958, we've had a total of 3 Burmese fellows, one 1958, one 1959, and one in 1982. And for many of us, I think at Harvard, at the Kennedy School surely, and more in the larger Harvard community, Burma is an unknown part of Asia. It's a part of Asia that's left out of the World Bank Asian Miracle Study, and it is certainly a part of Asia that's left out of the Edward Mason program. And so I felt, along with AA, that it would be very good, and I was very anxious to have this event presented here at the Kennedy School so that we might encourage more interest in Burma, more research on Burma, and perhaps someday again have students from Burma as colleagues working with us in this intellectual community. The other reason we're having this seminar is that November 25th marks the 20th anniversary of the death of Uthan, the Secretary General of the United Nations. So it's an appropriate time of the year to have this event. And also, from what I've read of a recent paper written by Tin Mint Oo and by a small booklet that I read that AA sent me, I've been learning a lot about Burma lately, and it's been a wonderful beginning to my own education. And what really impressed me a lot about Burma was the involvement of students in the history of Burma's struggle for independence and democracy. And I think, therefore, this is a fitting place to have this seminar in a school, in a university, and to try to encourage more students to take part in public policy. How we've organized the seminar this afternoon, we will first have June Bingham, the biographer of Uthan, to explain the man that we honor today. Next, John Badgley, who's the curator of the Eccles Southeast Asia collection at Cornell University. We will have him give us an historical context of Burma, the Burma that we're talking about today. And then, marching right to today, we will next have Thomas Hubbard, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific from the U.S. State Department and has just returned from Burma, to bring us up to date on U.S. policy toward Burma and to tell us of his recent trip there. And finally, we will have His Excellency Tan Sri Razali Ismail, the Malaysian Permanent Representative to the United Nations, bring us up to date on UN and ASEAN policy toward Burma. After these presentations, we will have time for your questions and comments. So let us begin now with our first speaker, June Bingham, who is an author, a playwright, and a librettist. And she has written dramas, musicals, which have been produced in Texas, in New York City, and at Barnard College. She has written books, The Courage to Change, which is an introduction to the life and thought of Reinhold Niebuhr, and The Pursuit of Health, another book, and of course the book that we're most interested in today on Uthan, The Search for Peace. She's written many articles and op-eds in newspapers all over the country and booklets, and has been an educator and a founder of something called the Trained Liaison Comforter, which maybe she can afterwards tell me more about. I'm quite interested. So we welcome Ms. Bingham, who has come to share with us a story of the life of Uthan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Grodkin, His Excellency, Mr. Secretary, Professor Badgley, ladies and gentlemen, or is it PC now to say women and men? In 1961, my late husband, Jonathan Bingham, was appointed one of Adlai Stevenson's team at the U.S. Mission for the UN. And in the course of our diplomatic duties, which included many receptions and dinners and lunches every week, we somehow always gravitated toward the ambassador from Burma. He was wise and he was funny, and he either had the latest diplomatic gossip to share with us or to enjoy whatever diplomatic gossip we could share with him. One of his favorite riddles was, what is the difference between a diplomat and a lady? The answer is, if the diplomat says yes, he means maybe. If he says maybe, he means no. And if he says no, he's no diplomat. Whereas if a lady says no, she means maybe. If she says maybe, she means yes. And if she says yes, she's no lady. As with many diplomatic couples, the Burmese ambassador's wife never came to these occasions. And many was late Friday afternoon when I was putting on my evening clothes as almost like a uniform that I thought how smart she was. Actually, we had heard that she was a devout Buddhist who was in mourning for the tragic bus accident which had claimed the life of their only son. Their only daughter, a lovely and beautiful and intelligent young woman, AA, had recently married Tin Minh U, who was a rising diplomat, and they were living with Uthan and Dorthain Tin in Riverdale in the Bronx. In addition to sharing shop talk and kidding one another, Uthan and we also discussed non-diplomatic subjects. I was then writing the biography of Reinhold Niebuhr, and Uthan asked me lots of questions about Niebuhr's Christianity. So then I asked him lots of questions about his own Buddhism. And although the two theologies are very different, we agreed that ethically and morally, the two seemed almost identical. And then, like a thunderclap on a sunny day, the plane crash, Dag Hammarskjöld was killed in the Congo. And with the Cold War at its iciest, it was very hard for the US and the USSR, not to mention all the other countries, to agree on a candidate for Secretary General. But finally and unanimously, they did agree on Uthan. And suddenly, my buddy was elevated to the 38th floor. Regretfully, we saw less of him. And when we did, he was his usual modest and cheerful self. And after my Niebuhr biography was published, I began searching for a new subject. There were three things that attracted me about Uthan. One was his unbreachable integrity. Another, of course, was his elevation to the top UN spot. And the third was my personal curiosity about his serenity. How deep did it go? How much was it related to Buddhism? Was it primarily an individual or a national characteristic? And here I think I should fairly reveal what biases I started with. My parents were both agnostic. My first book was written with the chief psychiatrist at the Yale Medical School. In part, I was attracted to psychiatry because of a hunger to try and understand human nature. And psychiatry offered a then new and impressive tool. But at the end of it, while I was grateful for its insights, and I still am, there was something missing. So I then became attracted to Niebuhr, who represented the Judeo-Christian biblical worldview, and that was fascinating also, and it answered many questions. But somehow at the end of it, I still didn't have the kind of serenity that Uthan exemplified. So I asked if I could write his biography, and he, the diplomat, did not give a straight no, but he said it was unlikely. So I let maybe half a year go by, and then I decided to sweeten the pie, and I went to him and I said, look, every other chapter will be about either Burma or Buddhism. And that way, a book about him would also expose Americans to these two subjects that they know abysmally little about. And it would also tell about the UN, which, as he knew and we know, the US Congress is not always very forthcoming about. By this time, my husband had moved figuratively over the dead body of my mother, from being an ambassador to being a congressman. And an invitation arrived one day from the 38th floor asking Congressman and Mrs. Bingham to lunch. And I sent word back that Mr. Bingham would be in Washington, but Mrs. Bingham would be thrilled to come, whereupon the answer came back, Mrs. Bingham and one of her daughters would be welcome for lunch. So I called my youngest, who was then at Vassar, and told her that she had to come and chaperone her old mother, which she did. And we appeared at the 38th floor, where Uthan and his chef de cabinet, C.V. Narasimhan, greeted us. We had a drink. Uthan liked daiquiris, and we sat down to lunch. Lots of funny stories were told by the two men. One was about a woman who complained to a speaker that his introduction of her husband had not given her husband his due. The speaker said, "Madam, I shall be glad to say even nicer things about your husband posthumously." "Oh, goody," she said, "the sooner the better." But neither Uthan nor Narasimhan referred to the book, and I suddenly realized that the whole lunch was going to go by without any result unless I substituted business for pleasure. So I asked Uthan which people in Burma I should write to, which books I should read, and when I could start interviews with him. He said he would give me names and numbers of people and titles of books, but he was far too busy to see me. I was permitted to come in once a month with my questions and talk to Narasimhan. So I did exactly as I was told, and it was disaster. CV is a good Hindu, and he was a distinguished former member of the Indian Civil Service, but he would be the first to say that he is not an expert on Burma or Buddhism. After I left him with my long list of questions that he couldn't answer, I received word from Uthan's secretary that I should come in for 50 minutes the following Saturday. So in I went, carrying a kitchen timer, which went dinging while Uthan and I were deep in conversation. It startled him. "What is that?" he said. He apparently led a domestically privileged life and had never heard a kitchen timer before. When I explained what it was, he laughed and said, "Pay it no attention." So we talked for another 15 minutes and made a date for the following month. There were many such meetings, all of which were invaluable to me. During that year, his daughter presented him with a grandson, a few months before my eldest daughter did the same. And let no one tell you that a devout Buddhist doesn't occasionally indulge in competitiveness. Uthan was constantly crowing about the accomplishments of Coco, while I trailed along, reporting on the younger and relatively unskilled Edward. As for Uthan's Buddhist meditation, as has been mentioned, he engaged in it morning and evening at the altar in his and Dorothy Tin's bedroom. For him, it was as necessary and refreshing as sleep. It involved, he said, a closing off of the senses, a concentration on inner reality. As he put it, you could set off a firecracker next to somebody who was meditating or waft some Chanel No. 5 under his nose, and he would not be distracted. The result is comparable to the action of the lungs on the blood. Impurities and fatigue are removed. The person feels energized, ready to tackle old problems with a new perspective or new problems without undue ego involvement. Instead of holding a grudge against someone who's injured you, you might ask, what might you have done to cause this injury, make him want to injure you? U Thant's old friend U Nu described meditation as the building of a massive wall of awareness. By this he meant exorcising both attachment and revulsion. And he compared it to the myth of Hercules lifting Antaeus up off the ground to weaken him. As U Nu said, by completely preventing the mind-defiling passions from arising through a constant application of the sense of awareness, mental states that produce defiling passions and thoughts wither and disappear. This thought was echoed by C.S. Lewis, who wrote, quote, "If the imagination were obedient, the appetites would give us very little trouble," end quote. Marie Biles, a Westerner who went to Burma to study Buddhism, has written, quote, "Names don't matter, but the psychological attitude of relaxing and trusting in a power not oneself matters very much indeed. This turning to a power or universal principle is for some Buddhists the essence of prayer. When they say they will pray for you, this implies a devout remembrance of the Buddha, who taught the efficacy of sending out loving and health-bringing thoughts." For U Thant, this sending out also makes the sender feel better. After a successful experience of meditation, U Thant said, "You feel metta, a feeling of give my love to everybody." Meditation, however, is not invariably successful. U Thant believed that in addition to the arid periods that everyone experiences, there are some people who, because of their nature or their youth, are not suited to its rigors. And he did not, for example, teach its techniques to his own young people. In Burma, many people uninterested in Buddhism in their youth turn to it in middle age. Indeed, the natural turning away from material concerns in later life is one reason why older people are held in such high regard in Burma. In any event, the person in Burma from whom I received most help for the book was the eldest of U Thant's 3 younger brothers. He was also the most devout. His name was U Kant, and he was as handsome as the day is long. But let no one tell you that devout Buddhists can't occasionally indulge in sibling rivalry, or as we call it in our family, controlled disloyalty. After hearing Kant's version of some long ago event, I would then clear it with his brother. Sometimes U Thant agreed and sometimes he didn't. But even when he disagreed, he might reveal more than he would have otherwise. Time came for me to go to Burma, to meet U Thant's mother and the 3 brothers, to see the great Shwe Dagon pagoda, to sail down the Irrawaddy River to a river town much like the old Pantanal of U Thant's youth. But the dictator of Burma, General Ne Win, was anti-American, as I guess he still is. U.S. citizens were allowed 24 hours at the airport between planes. I appealed to U Thant. Though in no way he wanted mine to be an authorized biography, he did intervene with Ne Win. Jonathan and I were already in Bangkok, actually, before we got word from the Burmese government that we could come in from the airport to Rangoon and stay for double the usual amount of time. So we wasted very few hours in sleep, and we took a lot of photos. Seeing the Burmese people in their home turf was very important in enabling me with some authority to imagine U Thant's boyhood, early manhood, and years as a teacher in Pantanal. Meanwhile, back at the UN, some personal and international events were unfolding that I only learned about later. One concerned U Thant's refusal of a raise in salary. Pay for the Secretary General had been set at $25,000 a year. But because of inflation and mandatory increases, the salaries of the UN officers under him kept mounting. It was clear that the Secretary General's salary would have to be lifted. But when the document to that effect was brought to U Thant for approval, he said no, he would not be party to a request to increase his own salary. So to the disappointment of his underlings, no change was made. The following year, the smart UN controller submitted the document not to U Thant, but to the General Assembly, which promptly approved it. When the controller went to Uthan to inform them that his salary was now $30,000 a year, Uthan said, "What is the next item on your agenda?" As George Sadler, who used to work at the UN, says today, that was typical of Uthan. He was relaxed, unemotional, not the least concerned with his personal circumstances or any self-aggrandizement. Actually, I think it typifies the way in which he took his job seriously, but not himself. Sir Brian Urquhart, who worked closely with Uthan and Ralph Bunche, is still full of praise for Uthan's fearless honesty. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Uthan wrote both to President Kennedy and to Khrushchev, suggesting moves that each could make to de-escalate the crisis. And each went along to some degree with his request. Another time, when Uthan was in Moscow, the Kremlin figured he was perfectly safe to allow to speak on Soviet radio. Imagine their surprise to hear the mild-mannered Secretary General telling the Russian people what a shame it was that they had not been given the facts about what their country was doing in the Congo. As Urquhart says, Uthan always cared more about moral behavior than political behavior. Similarly, Uthan was outspoken in his disapproval of America's escalation of the Vietnam conflict and publicly announced to Americans that we were not being given all the facts, and actually going nose to nose with Lyndon Johnson on the subject. After one of his White House visits, he gave to a friend of his a cigarette lighter with LBJ on it. The friend made a face. Uthan laughed and withdrew the lighter and gave her another one with President Kennedy's PT boat on it, which she treasures to this day. Another time, this friend and her husband, he was a sort of vitamin freak, were guests of Uthan's for dinner in Riverdale. Most of the other guests were medical doctors. Uthan introduced his male friend as a doctor of vitamins, and then sat back to watch with amusement as the poor friend tried to explain his lack of credentials. In addition to occasional fit of mischief, Uthan was not beyond a rare flash of annoyance. After a delegate who had lied to him left his office, Uthan exclaimed, "Que mata," which I believe is the Burmese for son of a bitch. And long before, when he was young and his foster son had not only been a truant for months, but lied to Uthan about it, Uthan formed a fist and pushed it forward. It didn't hit the boy, but it did go through a glass door. Finally, my manuscript was finished. And Uthan said he would read it, he would read it. So my husband and I walked it over to his house in Riverdale. Uthan greeted me at the door, took the manuscript, held it a minute, and then handed it back. "I think I won't read it after all," he said. "I don't wish to be implicated in any way in the writing of a book about myself." "But no one would ever know," I said. He gave me a stern look. "I would," he said. So that was that. And the book appeared with a few, I must say, thank God, very few details that could have been corrected by him. Later, even more happily, I received a call from the publisher. Guess who had ordered 50 copies? Uthan's integrity remained intact, though his modesty was under threat, for the reviews of the book often said wonderfully kind things about him. As for his serenity, it too continued, though I concluded it was more of an individual talent than a national one. On the other hand, he did develop stomach ulcers, which often accompany stress, during the worst of the subsequent terrible UN crises. Yet without his daily Buddhist meditation, the ulcers might have come on far earlier or been worse. In any event, they did little to interfere with his accomplishments on the world scene, and he remained true to himself and his ideals to the very end, 20 years ago.
John Badgley received his master's degree at Johns Hopkins and at SAIS, has a PhD from UC Berkeley. He's been awarded 2 Fulbrights at Rangoon Hopkins Center in 57 and 58, and then again later. He's taught at Johns Hopkins, at Miami University, and he set up the Institute of the Rockies. Since 1986, Mr. Badgley has been curator of the John M. Eccles Southeast Asia Collection at Cornell University. He's published 2 books on Burmese politics and economics, economic development, and he's currently writing a novel. Mr. Badgley.
Dr. Grodson, Ambassador Razali, Mr. Hubbard, Ms. Bingham, and particularly ASEA and Timiu, I want to thank you for being here. This is a unique opportunity for me. I'm sure it won't be repeated, and I'm sure this kind of gathering has not occurred before. I say that because of the context we find ourselves in, leaping to the conclusion Aung San Suu Kyi is in the process of working her way out of house arrest. We're in the midst of a transition in Burma that is hopefully bringing back onto an even keel a distortion that has gone on for 30 years, much too long. At the same time, something else is happening that I find even more exciting, and that is the re-entry into the mainstream of world intellectual life, the best of Burmese young people. I say that out of a sense of looking here in the audience. I see a few Burmese. We have more Burmese at Cornell right now than we've ever had in our history. There are over 100,000 Burmese in the United States. And as I will get to shortly, there's been a major reason for that. But one has a sense from the email that I'm now plugged into that there is a very active Burmese net exchanging the kinds of things that the state scholars in the 50s used to talk about, with a sense of efficacy about what's going on in Burma as well as what's going on in the world of development. When AA called me and asked me to speak, it was not long ago, and I hesitated. She wanted me to speak about students, and certainly I've been involved with Burmese students since the mid-50s. At the same time, I certainly am not an authority on the history of student life. On the other hand, a colleague who is writing a book with me about Burmese political thought, Dr. H.A., has just published a book through Cornell called The Voice of Young Burma. And I would recommend that to you who want to know more about the heritage of Burmese political life at Rangoon University. I've entitled what I want to say, Razu, Burma's Icon of Freedom. Razu in quotes, Rangoon Arts and Science University. University Union. We gather this evening to honor Uthan, to address an issue he believed in and to which he dedicated his life. In the decade before coming to New York as Burma's ambassador to the United Nations, he had served U Nu as chief of cabinet, his confidant and key advisor. Before that, he was a teacher and school administrator. He entered Rangoon University in 1926, at the age of 17, passed the intermediate exam 2 years later, and at 19 returned to teach in his hometown of Pantana, down in the Delta. In the next 2 decades, he moved up to principal, then township superintendent, and in 1942, as the Japanese were invading, he served on a National Educational Review Commission to overhaul Burma's education system. After the war, he served at U Nu's elbow as a voice of moderation in restructuring not only education, but the entire economy and political system. After 1955, his critical thinking and wise counsel was instrumental in guiding Burma through its first years as a leader in the non-aligned movement. His reputation for fairness explains his acceptance to both Russians and Americans as a successor to Dag Hammarskjöld. Though never privileged to meet him, I feel a kinship because of his ongoing struggle at home and in the UN against ideas founded on platitudes and cartoons of reality. My topic, Razu, Burma's icon of freedom, serves as a kind of background, a reference point for where Burma is and how it got there. However, for me, this subject is also a foretaste of where Burma is going. You see, Razu, an acronym for Rangoon Arts and Science Students Union, was a student organization founded in 1928 that served as a springboard for UNU, Aung San, and most of the politicians who advocated independence and democracy after World War II. 3/4 of a century later, it no longer formally exists. Yet, had you visited the campus 2 years ago as I did, you would have found each cement post in the fence surrounding the campus marked by flowers and a name sign, each post dedicated to a student martyred in the ongoing struggle for freedom. From its inception in 1920, Rangoon University has connoted freedom of inquiry, uninhibited pursuit of knowledge, and political liberty. It also denoted Burma's most public avenue of social and economic advancement, a ride to the top if one could pass the entrance exams and afford the tuition. A national student strike heralded its inception, and a succession of demonstrations and strikes marked its growth from a small college of 200 students to Burma's most potent center of opposition to military rule with 60,000 students today. During the colonial period, the British neither sent troops on the campus nor closed it down for more than a few days. However, 3 times in the past 3 decades, 1962, 74, and 88, Ne Win has dispatched battalions of combat troops to sweep through the campus, arrest leaders, and crush organized student resistance. Each time the university was closed for longer periods. Has any country had so dramatic a confrontation as did Razu on July 7th, 1962, when their student union building was literally blown up, with student leaders still inside, following a day of arrests and shootings into the mass demonstrators. Hundreds were killed, though the government reported only 48 deaths and 80 wounded. Razu was silenced, but not for long. On December 1st, 1974, after Uthan died, his family returned to inter his body in a mausoleum near the Shwedagon Phaya. However, senior government officials were forbidden to meet the plane at Mingladon Airport. Nonetheless, it was carried to Chaikasan racetrack for viewing. Ne Win's plan then was to bury him in a nondescript public cemetery. Anticipating this move to humiliate UNU's most prominent friend, Razu organizers led some 20,000 students, townspeople, and monks to seize his body and moved it for viewing in Convocation Hall at his alma mater. The confrontation on campus was savage, and once again the government demonstrated its monopoly of violence, while Razu again proved itself to be a bastion of courage, with a new generation of students giving the supreme sacrifice for freedom. Some 4,000 were arrested this time. An unknown number were killed. Hundreds were permanently maimed through torture. So it can be no surprise to those of you familiar with Burma's political landscape that after Aung San Suu Kyi returned early in 1988 to care for her ailing mother, that when a band of university students on a nearby campus rioted over a small, unrelated incident, a potent connection was made between these two powerful forces. In mid-August, following 3 weeks of mayhem sanctioned and administered by a wild general, Sein Lwin, Dr. Maung Maung, Ne Win's biographer and a retired Supreme Court justice, took over an ad hoc administration. He negotiated a host of compromises and permitted Suu Kyi to speak when she was invited by a coalition of Razu and other national leaders to a gathering near the Shwedagon, following the Sein Lwin debacle. Over 500,000 people gathered to hear her message. There were twin messages, actually, of encouragement to advocates for democracy and conciliation with Tatmadaw, the military her father had founded. We tend to forget about that part of her message, but that was central then, and it remains central in her conversations. It was a magic moment, but Dr. Maung Maung's administration fell on September 18th in a Ne Win-sanctioned coup led by General Sa Maung, chief of the armed forces. Blood commenced to flow the following day and for a month thereafter. Upwards to 10,000 students, demonstrators, and innocent civilians were killed in sweeps through the cities of Burma. More vicious and far-reaching than events in China the following year, this strike against democratic opponents would have devastated most societies. Yet within 2 years, the same opposition had reorganized itself and ran an astonishingly successful campaign in an election the military administered and expected to win with their National Unity Party. The NUP won few seats. Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy swept in with over 60% of the vote and 80% of the seats in what was generally believed to be an election to create a constitutional assembly. But democracy was disallowed. To this day, Aung San Suu Kyi remains under house arrest. Her NLD is decimated by arrests and suppression of party activity. The elected parliament was never allowed to sit, while the Constitutional Convention, in quotes, formed by members selected by SLORC, the State Law and Order Restoration Council, writes a new constitution. In the interim, a range of external political and economic changes swirled around and through Burma. Most unrelenting is China's powerful economy, which is pulling the Burmese into its trade and investment sphere, much as Mexico and Canada are drawn into the American economic sphere of influence. For the first time in a decade, Burma's economy is again growing. 30 years of military rule has turned Burmese society upside down. The educated elite who governed during the democracy period between 1948-62 is replaced by a military elite. Political theorists would call them a monistic cabal, dedicated to suppression of pluralism as an enemy of the state. Indeed, the federal political structure needed to reflect the existing cultural systems is anathema to the social contract established by Ne Win after his March 3, 1962 coup. The depth of this topsy-turvy world can be found in many ways. One that is most intriguing can be found in elite marriage patterns. Weddings among the elite were always unusually public in Burma. During the 1950s, prominent business families and government leaders often sought husbands for their daughters from the ranks of state scholars, the young men who returned from the UK, Australia, the US, and Japan with advanced degrees. Nowadays, the graduates of the military academy attract the attention of wealthy families with eligible daughters, while ambitious civilian degree holders migrate to better-paying jobs abroad. For example, Little Jamaica has over 100 Burmese physicians. 100,000 Burmese now live in the States, compared to less than 20,000 only a decade ago. And many UN agencies have a full quota of Burmese professionals driven to live abroad rather than suffer the indignities and frustration of living in their homeland. In thinking about Burmese politics, I see it as a metaphor of struggle between two armed camps. For the heart of a state that never gained a consensus as to its identity. One camp is led by the very well-armed political party known to Burmese as Tatmadaw, who I see as a political party, while the other is led by a federation of disciplined small armies of ethnic insurgents, some of whom are allied with Burmese students and politicians of democratic persuasion. Penetrating both camps are well-armed drug gangs of enormous wealth who can afford to corrupt both sides. Monists versus pluralists, corporate statists versus liberal constitutionalists, an internationally recognized army versus a set of small armies unrecognized by the international community, but sustained in the margins by NGOs committed to working with refugees. Whether thinking in the abstraction as a political theorist or working on the ground to resolve the half-century of conflict, the reality of Burmese political life is complicated and fraught with problems unlikely to yield just to good intentions and faith in the human heart. The tragedy for Burmese students, generation after generation, is that they have been sucked into each of these two polar extremes, and today they despair for any resolution of the conflict short of victory by Aung San Suu Kyi. Burmese cultures, complicated and diverse though they are being forced to respond to the massive changes in the surrounding world. In my library travels to Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and Burma since 1986, I found no less an interest among urbanites in Burma than among people in their neighboring countries in global communications, market economics, and the lifestyle of an Asia integrated with the West. For example, BBC and VOA are authoritative sources throughout Burma because they inform the public about these changes. Likewise, the power of videos is no less relevant because pirated tapes of current American movies are as likely to play on VCRs in Delta villages as soon as they get to our own theaters, at least in upstate New York and Ithaca. Maybe they get to Cambridge faster. My colleague, Dr. Acha, recently published a little book titled Voice of Young Burma. In authoritative fashion, he traces the story of student leadership from 1920 up to independence. That voice is no less important today than it was in 1920 when the first student-led national strike tied Rangoon in knots. In my visits to Burma, I generally stay with families I've known for decades, and I've had many chances to converse with their children and friends. I've traveled to Mandalay a number of times by train, and in 1988 I used third-class train and boat, as well as bus and truck, like most students, in visiting universities in Moulmein, Bassein, and many other larger towns while critiquing their libraries. I gained a strong sense that Burma's student culture remains vital, and the vision of freedom so long represented by the Razu symbol continues to be the foundation for democracy's resurgence. Although Slork's critics are wise to remain skeptical until representative institutions are reinstalled and some form of a federal constitution is operative, Burma's progress to more peaceful times will eventually come to pass. I suspect most of us in this room hope Aung San Suu Kyi can pick up the democratic mantle that Uthan and his generation of leaders created. But Ne Win tossed aside. And whatever happens, one can be certain Burma's course will be unique. Geography, history, the complex cultures of this benighted land require creative responses to cope with the realities of peoples locked in relations of enmity and suspicion for decades and in some cases for centuries. Whatever the passions of youth, or whether the passions of youth will permit a new generation of student leaders to follow the cool, calculated compromises proposed by Suu Kyi, which are essential if the country is to work through the current impasse, remains to be seen. Thanks.
Okay, now we've been brought up to date. We're ready to look to the future from our next two speakers. Thomas Hubbard received a Bachelor's of Arts degree from the University of Alabama and joined the Foreign Service in the United States in 1965. He has served the Foreign Service in many countries, including Japan, Dominican Republic, and France. From 1987 to 89, Mr. Hubbard was Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and from 1989 to 93, he served as Minister and Deputy Chief of Mission, U.S. Embassy in Manila, Philippines. Today, he is the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. He attained the rank of Minister Counselor in the Senior Foreign Service in 1989. Mr. Hubbard.
Thank you very much. I am pleased and honored to have been invited to come here to Harvard to help commemorate the 20th anniversary of the date of the death of a major international statesman. I'm pleased to have this chance to come and both speak about Burma and to hear about Burma from friends of Burma and people who know that country much better than I do. So I'm very grateful to Mrs. Bingham and to Professor Badgley for educating me on Uthan and on the history of Burma. And I'm particularly pleased to be here with Ambassador Razali, an old colleague of mine from Kuala Lumpur who has spent more time, I think, in the United States in the last 10 years than I have, and I'm pleased to have a chance to see him here. You will have heard from Ms. Gradson's introduction that I have very little reason to claim to be an expert on Burma. I do consider myself to be a friend of Burma, if a relatively new one, and I am becoming deeply acquainted with the situation in Burma through my efforts to to help develop and implement a U.S. government policy on Burma. Something that you don't hear about that often beyond places like Harvard and sometimes New York. As many of you probably know, the United States government has conducted a thoroughgoing and overall review of its Burma policy during the spring and summer of this year. I chaired the interagency working group that conducted that review. In particular, we have focused on how to make progress on 3 policy objectives that we consider urgent. That is democratization, respect for human rights, and counter narcotics cooperation with Burma. During the course of this study, we considered a wide variety of options and reaffirmed our deep concern about the situation in Burma. The decision we reached was not to change our message, but rather to change the way in which we deliver our message. We decided to be more active, to see if we could enhance our influence by presenting our strong concerns more directly to the SLORC. The policy review reaffirmed our view that it was not the international community which had somehow isolated Burma, but rather Burma had isolated itself through policies that are out of line with accepted international norms. Our conclusion was that in order for Burma's relationship with the United States to change, Burma had to change its policies. In particular, the current military leadership in Rangoon, the SLORC, has to find a way to allow the views of the vast majority of Burmese to determine their nation's political future. As you know better than I, the overwhelming majority of Burma's citizens voted in 1990 for the National League for Democracy. Human rights is the second area that must change in Burma. After nearly 6 years, Aung San Suu Kyi remains under house arrest. Many of her advisors in the National League for Democracy are in jail or have been hounded out of Burma into exile. In the State Department, we receive a steady flow of credible reports of continuing human rights violations in Burma. Many of these violations of international norms occur in connection with forced labor on civil engineering types of projects, like the Ye Tavoy Railway, the Mandalay Moat, and smaller-scale road repair and water sewage projects all over Burma, especially in contested areas in the ethnic minority townships. Another major source of human rights violations is forced porterage for the Burmese military. We have reliable reports of death and woundings in connection with forced porterage in battle areas of the Shan State and elsewhere. Press gangs are sent out by the military to pick up men in villages, some a good distance away from the location where the actual porterage work is carried out. Those found and ordered into porterage testify that they are mistreated, uncompensated, and suffer additional economic losses by being taken abruptly away from other crucially important economic activities, such as harvesting. There is corroborating evidence for human rights violations in the condition in which many of the Burmese refugees appear in Thailand. We are told by the welfare agencies that minister to them that refugees frequently must enter a facility for intensive care when they first appear in Thailand. Village people in Burma are very near the edge of existence, even when they are simply left alone by the military to endure average hardships of village life. When additional demands are placed on them by a military unit seeking labor or forced porterage, frequently these poor villagers are pushed over the edge into a decision to get out of Burma, and they arrive in Thailand sick and unhealthy. The third area where change must occur in Burma is in narcotics production and trafficking. During the period of SLORC rule, opium heroin production in Burma has doubled, and the drug trade has become more deeply ingrained in the political and economic life of the country. At present, Burma produces roughly 2/3 of the heroin on the American streets. There is no solution to the world's heroin problem which does not involve Burma. The SLORC argues that its policy is to oppose narcotics production, refining, and trafficking. It points to the battles it has mounted against Kunsa and his warlord army. It points to its casualties and argues that narcotics production in Burma is in geographic regions presently outside the SLORC's control. The SLORC leadership shows great interest in narcotics cooperation, particularly crop substitution assistance and enforcement cooperation. The narcotics picture in Burma is a matter of direct interest to the United States, and we are prepared to expand narcotics cooperation with the SLORC if we are convinced that such assistance will be effective and not undermine our objectives in the human rights and democratization fields. The narcotics problem goes well beyond the threat posed by any single narco-trafficker like Kunsa. It is rooted in decades of civil war, unaccountable government, and corruption. That is why we believe that in the long run, there is no trade-off between the need for political reform in Burma and the imperative of drug control. We want to move forward on all our objectives simultaneously. We will not allow the SLORC to pick and choose the issues it finds less controversial or easier to handle in Burma. As we see movement in other areas, including human rights, and signs of good faith willingness to work with us, we are, however, prepared to respond through enhanced cooperation on counter-narcotics. Let me now discuss how my recent trip to Rangoon, as the first senior U.S. envoy in some 6 years, fits into the context of our overall objectives in Burma. I went to Burma representing an interagency consensus in Washington to voice our concerns directly to the senior SLORC leadership, face to face, so that there would be no possibility of misunderstanding. I had with me representatives of the National Security Council and of the Human Rights and Counter-Narcotics Bureaus of the State Department. I stressed American friendship and respect for the Burmese people and made clear that the United States would like to establish more constructive relations with the people of Burma. Our mission was to present two views of the future. One, where the Burmese leadership undertakes steps to improve its performance in democratization, human rights, and counter-narcotics, with the result that its relationship with the United States can improve. And a second vision, linked to continued regime intransigence and a deteriorating relationship with the United States. We made clear that we vastly prefer the first vision, but that the choice is up to the SLORC. We were well received in Rangoon, both by SLORC leaders and by those representatives of the broader community whom we were able to see at informal gatherings. Our 3-hour meeting with Ken Yunt began with his lengthy discussion of recent Burmese history, a version that differed quite markedly from that we just heard from Professor Badgley. Ken Yunt stressed the Burmese Army's role in maintaining national unity. He spoke a lot about national reconciliation. Not surprisingly, however, he placed more emphasis on national unity and national security than on human rights or the establishment of representative government. He also made very clear the current military leadership's interest in economic development for Burma. He stressed that Burma seeks foreign investment and access to modern technology. As I noted above, he also made clear that Burma wants narcotics cooperation with the United States. The desire for economic development through international cooperation, of course, represents a significant break with much of the Ne Win past. I responded that access to international lending and foreign technology would flow naturally from respect for human rights and a genuine democratic opening. Without significant progress in those areas, the United States would have no choice but to continue to oppose international lending and assistance. Clearly, the United States also has an interest in economic reform and liberalization in Burma, a nation of vast, untapped economic potential. But we also believe, as Secretary Christopher argued in Jakarta this month, that the foundation of open economies, rights that protect contracts, property, and patents, can only be guaranteed over time by rule of law. and open economies, Secretary Christopher said, ultimately depend on open societies. In that sense, we agree with Aung San Suu Kyi when she says that, quote, success of any economic or political system depends on confidence between the business sector, the government, and the public. I cannot say that I am optimistic that dramatic change will soon be forthcoming. I was impressed by General Ken Yunt's willingness to listen, even when the message was delivered without ornamentation. After all, part of my message was to make clear that in the absence of progress on human rights, democratization, and counter-narcotics, Burma will remain outside the mainstream of the international community. In short, a continued failure to respect human rights and to permit representative government will have a negative impact on prospects for economic development and also on international acceptance for the Burmese government. And if I emerged with any sense of optimism, it was that the SLORC seems to realize that it needs the world, that it needs to open up to the outside world if it is going to get the investment and technology transfer that it realizes it needs for progress. We received some more specific positive signals during our stop in Burma. Ken Yunt stated that the talks with Aung San Suu Kyi would continue. On an issue of particular importance to us, he indicated that the Burmese government would soon reach agreement with the ICRC on prison visits. We were told that the SLORC welcomes a dialogue with the UN, and a representative of the Secretary General was in Rangoon for talks beginning last week. Finally, during our meeting with General Ken Yunt, the SLORC authorized U.S. government experts to conduct an opium yield survey in Burma next February. We were disappointed that the SLORC refused our request to meet with Aung San Suu Kyi and other political prisoners. Allowing foreigners to meet with these courageous prisoners of conscience would be reassuring to the international community. It would also be symbolic of SLORC willingness to take the steps it needs to take itself to reduce its international isolation. And finally, the United States will look to Aung San Suu Kyi for a judgment on whether political reconciliation is making progress in Burma. So access to her is important for us. But the important point, of course, is that the SLORC work with her and with other democratic forces to promote genuine political reconciliation within Burma. In summary, then, our objective in going to Burma was to deliver a clear message. As I have emphasized, our message remained the same. If the U.S. and Burma are to have a more cooperative relationship, and we want such a relationship for the benefit of the peoples of Burma and the United States, it is the current military leadership in Burma which needs to make changes. Those changes must come in democratization, human rights, and more vigorous counter-narcotics efforts. We could not, of course, expect the Burmese leadership to commit on the spot to the changes we sought, and they didn't. We could expect a good hearing by the top leadership, and we did get a good hearing. In this sense, it seems to me that our mission was worthwhile. That brings to us the question of where we go from here. The United States is prepared to do what it can to encourage positive change in Burma. We will be observing the situation in Burma carefully over the next few months. We will look for progress in the areas we have identified as important to us. We hope that a substantive dialogue will result between Aung San Suu Kyi and the SLORC, and that Aung San Suu Kyi will be released. The sooner the better. We also urge that all the other political prisoners in Burma be released. Based on what we heard in Burma, we would expect an agreement between the Burmese government and the ICRC on prison visits. And if one is achieved, we would welcome it publicly. In short, we are expectant observers of events in Burma. We hope that the SLORC will decide that good relations with the United States are worth some tough decisions and actions on key issues, and we will be ready to respond. One cannot visit Burma without feeling a sense of tragedy that a resource-rich land and a vibrant people have been deprived by repressive government of the progress and prosperity enjoyed by their neighbors. We would like to see Burma join the Asian economic miracle, and will do what we can to promote the conditions necessary for that to take place. We will, of course, wish to stay in touch with the Friends of Burma at Harvard and elsewhere as we seek to exercise any influence that we have to promote the kinds of change that we all seek in Burma. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker, Tan Sri Razali Ismail, the Malaysian permanent representative to the United Nations, did his undergraduate work at the University of Malaya, majoring in humanities and literature, and he's had a 30-year diplomatic career in India, France, UK, in Laos. His first ambassadorial post was in Poland, and then he returned as ambassador to India. For the last 7 years, he served in the United Nations. It is a special pleasure we have today to have him with us. I remember 2 years ago we were doing an event on environment at the Kennedy School, and everyone said, "Get Ambassador Razali, he's very good." And another time we were doing something on Asia, and they said, "Get Ambassador Razali, he's a very wise man." So I'm especially pleased today that finally we have brought Ambassador Razali here to the Kennedy School.
I wish I could have changed the introduction a bit. Anyway, I'm very happy to be here. I think everybody from the UN would be happy to come to Hubbard to speak to a gathering like this. I'm also, as a Malaysian, I'm happy to be associated with any efforts to celebrate a great man of Southeast Asia, Uthan. At this point in time, the UN is at 30th floor is not doing as well as it should. This is my personal view. It would be very helpful to have the capacity of some person with the ability to interact and consult with a maximum number of delegations that are working in the UN. We do not have such a situation. Although the issues are very important, very sharply focused, but the interaction between the 38th floor and other members of the delegations are not there. It's not there. I have only been to Burma once. I should have done more, but I went there some years ago following my prime minister. We sat in a bungalow, and my prime minister was talking to Ne Win. In the sort of lull of within the conversation, Ne Win said that my people have discovered a jade, a big piece of jade in the jungle somewhere. And we thought we would bring a forklift to take out the jade. When we went there, we found out that it was bigger than we had expected. It was a mountain of jade. And that we had to slice that stone, slice by slice, because there was no way we could take out that jade. And he looked straight at my prime minister and said, "Mr. Prime Minister, this is our destiny. This is the way Burma is. We can take care of ourselves." I wonder whether that little anecdote illustrates anything. I went to Pagan with the Prime Minister. I sat on the top of one of the temples, looked over the horizon, looking at all the other temples from that position. You cannot, if you are there in Pagan, where I was, you cannot imagine, it would be completely inconceivable that there could happen so many terrible things in Burma. As you sat there, you couldn't believe it. Anyway, back to the subject today. I'm not an expert. I'm a diplomat, so in the way of diplomats, we compromise as we go along. So you're not going to get very things with true intellectual integrity, if I may say so. My views do not represent the views of the government of Malaysia, but the main strain would approximate the kind of sentiments we hold about Burma, if not necessarily policies. Well, the events of 1988 and the denial of the election results in Burma obviously have put into very sharp focus Burma in the internationally. then part of that focus and pressure has been towards releasing those that have been detained, particularly Aung San Suu Kyi, and trying to push for a reinstatement of those people that won the election in 1990, and to end all oppressive actions. At the United Nations, these international efforts have found expression, articulation in the report that's looked at annually in the Commission on Human Rights. This is the report of the Special Rapporteur, whose report this year, I read it last week, is not very satisfactory, meaning he didn't have any recommendations and conclusions as yet. Where this report will be looked at by a committee in the UN of the General Assembly, then progressively a resolution will come out from the General Assembly approximating the views of the various delegations in the UN. That draft is now available, and that draft will more or less, again, call for the restoration of the results of the democratic elections in 1990, release of all political prisoners, especially Aung San Suu Kyi, and the ceasing of all oppressive actions. To support the efforts internationally, there is a virtual ban on any development assistance to Burma. The United Nations Development Program, UNDP, has held back something like $20 million to Burma. If sometimes I say Myanmar, I hope you do not mind, but we're used to saying Myanmar instead of Burma now. Anyway, there is $20 million being held back from UNDP to Burma. And it is my information that no international financial institution, including Bretton Woods, have made available to Burma any kind of development assistance, except perhaps on humanitarian aspects. And all efforts of certain countries to make available development assistance have been discouraged, principally by United States and by Western Europe. But even as these pressures have been mounted, SLOC, as we see it, continues to take a position of resistance. And at the same time, would argue that they have taken certain steps that would constitute steps towards restoring democracy to the people. These include claim, progress, and consensus at the National Convention, reconciliation with ethnic minorities, efforts to develop the border areas, return of refugees to Burma with UNHCR involvement, some kind of dialogue with a European troika. I do not have the details of that. European Union troika. And meeting, of course, with meeting of SLOC with Aung San Suu Kyi, and 3 meetings at the UN between the representative of the Secretary General and SLOC. 1 more meeting recently in Rangoon. And of course, there was this the meeting of Mr. Hubbard in Burma, and an earlier one, a visit of Mr. Richardson. This would constitute the kind of efforts that had taken place, as is well known even to all of you here. Now, in the context of the present General Assembly of the United Nations, delegations are being presented as of a situation, where Burma is concerned, of the continuation of the negative factors, that is the detention, the brutal actions of the government, of SLOC, all that I have mentioned before. At the same time, delegations are being presented by the Burmese delegation that there have been certain developments, the ones that I have mentioned just now. So when we draw up the resolution for this year, both aspects, the positive and the negative aspects, would have to be taken into account. And we would also want to emphasize or try to maximize the full potential of the discussions the representative of the Secretary General will have in subsequent meetings with the military authorities in Burma. We want to maximize that. I need to point out here, with a certain amount of embarrassment, that the efforts at the United Nations on Burma have not been done or been directed by the neighbors of Burma. This includes the countries of ASEAN. These efforts have mostly come from Western countries, although in the course of framing together a resolution, the ASEAN countries are brought into consultations. And at the end of the day, when a resolution is there, and in the last 2 years there has been a consensus resolution, one could see clearly the views of some of the views of the ASEAN countries have been incorporated into that resolution. Now the question may be asked, how useful are these efforts at the UN? Despite attempts by the United States and by Western Europe to ensure that no development assistance get to Burma, at the private sector level, no country has really shunned away from Burma and the attractions of the profitable business in Burma. The ASEAN countries are no exception. The opportunities that can open up in a resource-rich Burma, which is making a transition from socialist economy to a free market economy, can be very wide-ranging and can be very profitable. Now comes to the sticky part of what I have to say. At the United Nations, delegations are coming to grips or acquiescing to a situation where external pressures notwithstanding, future course of events in Burma must take into account of the military as an enduring power base. The military at the local community level, we know this, have established itself nationwide in various associations to ensure that there will be no repeat of the election results of 1990. The constitution that's being drawn up by the National Convention has guaranteed a place for the military, a very powerful place for the military. In coming to grips with all this, the objective of fully reinstating those that won the election in 1990 to take over the reins of power of government is becoming more and more remote, serving well enough as an ideal, but perhaps not quite attainable as an immediate objective. Even those that have been part of the external pressure, the big countries, US and Europe, United States, would now have taken into account that whatever happens into the future will have to happen at a pace and in a way that must take into account the people that are in power and the Burmese way, and conditioned by experiences of the region and past instances. This is not to say that democracy will not come to Burma, but the process will be slow, with adjustment to suit attendant conditions. It is a moot point whether even those that agitated for a transfer of power in 1988, claiming a misrule of 28 years, are themselves now not also having to come to grips that one that has to take into some account what has taken place, including the convention, the constitution that has been drawn up at the National Convention. I have spoken to some NGO bodies who have also spoken like this, and who have said that the product of the work of the National Convention may well have to be, I'll try to choose my word as wisely as possible, may well have to be taken into account of, perhaps by a bigger body in Burma. Ideally, that body should be representative, but the work of the National Convention cannot now be totally rejected. The neighbors of Burma, especially the ASEAN countries, are particularly sensitive and embarrassed about the situation in Burma. It has embarrassed us in ASEAN as we set the standards for what we want to do in the future. ASEAN would like to think that Burma is an aberration, but there is also another aberration in Southeast Asia, that of the atrocities of the Khmer Rouge. So we have two aberrations in Burma, in Southeast Asia. Basically, there is no running away for ASEAN countries of having to deplore strongly the brutal, systematic violations of human rights in Burma and the existence of a power apparatus as of absolute authority that we have now. The countries of ASEAN are not comfortable of not being able to effect a clear role for itself in the context of the situation in Burma. The ASEAN so-called constructive engagement policy is an attempt to try to balance between our strong disapproval and embarrassment and a belief that not all doors should be closed to Burma for fear that Burma will go totally inward looking. And if you look back into history, I'm told, that would be to the detriment and disadvantage of the Burmese people. There are one or two ASEAN countries that particularly would have very strong misgivings of Burma going that way and depending increasingly on China. ASEAN countries have had to pay a price, being criticized for faint-heartedness, for political timidity, and for being lured by the economic benefits of ameliorating business with Burma. The bottom line is, ASEAN countries do not believe that a hardline approach would restore the Burmese people their democratic rights. Total economic boycott would add to the sufferings of the people. These views are shared by many delegations in the United Nations. You have to understand, at the United Nations, Burma is one of several cases of countries undergoing serious violations of human rights and the denial of democratic government. Delegations in the United Nations can see the different standards being applied for each specific instance or each specific country. You have to look only at Bosnia, where very clearly Europe remains indicted for political timidity, for, I would go even further, for double dealing on Bosnia. You see the headlines, you know what's going on now. You have to look at, the United States. It acts as a regional monitor for the Americas. It is willing to jump into Haiti, but it does nothing. It turns a blind eye on violations of human rights in the Middle East and elsewhere. So the delegations at the United Nations can see the different standards being applied. There is, in effect, no international standard in terms of enforcement. This further weakens the so-called international response. As far as Burma is concerned, it is also not the way of the region in Southeast Asia to be openly castigatory to situations in Burma. This is for the ASEAN countries. I do not hide this. Because ASEAN countries are very circumspect. I mean, this is the way of the region. We speak almost in very epigrammatic fashion. We are careful about going towards situations where we could be accused of interfering in affairs of others. For one thing, it's not as if all the ASEAN countries, in the context of democracy, have moved at the same pace and at the same time. And there have been instances within ASEAN countries, not all, where the military have intervened, at times allegedly because of excesses of political parties' actions and all that. The military have intervened. And that intervention has brought about stability, and in turn, the people have benefited, and in turn, the military authorities have given back the authority to rule to the people, or at least there is a sharing of power. So you have, in essence, the region applying lessons drawn from its own experiences. I think this is a fact that has to be taken into account. Of course, in the context of ASEAN constructive engagement, we try to do this at all levels, in all fields: political, economic, social, cultural, academic, and technical. At the political level, we have invited Burmese leaders, they have come. Recently, the Burmese foreign minister was in Bangkok for the meeting of the ASEAN foreign ministers. But at all these meetings, the message has been very clear. We have underlined the need for SLOC to redeem its image and to restore democracy to Burma. We have also pointed out to the Burmese authorities that about the benefits of democratic practices and political stability and how these factors would affect development. ASEAN leaders have been very candid in telling Burma that urgent reforms are needed to bring Burma into the mainstream. In the last couple of years, or last 1 or 2 years, the foreign minister of Indonesia has been there, the prime minister of Singapore has been there, several ministers from Malaysia, primary industries and environment, and the Burmese strongman Kin Yoon has been to some countries in ASEAN, and in December, Kin Yoon will be coming to Malaysia. ASEAN governments believe that economics and trade can play a role in efforts to win over Burma. One cannot deny the self-interest aspect involved here. But in stimulating economic growth of Burma, we can induce the country to open up further and be more responsive to change. In our discussions with SLOC, SLOC also has said that political and economic development cannot be separated, and the presence of one will promote the other. You have to take that statement prima facie, whatever the value of that. We have also given technical assistance to Burma predicated on the belief that Burma will have to go into the future ready for what will come. And we would have to have enough people in Burma understanding their skills and having capacity to manage, for modern management in order to undertake what will come in the future. Because of the situation in Burma now, there is a vacuum. And some of the ones that can get out are outside. But nevertheless, we have to get the technicians, the officials, the veterinarians, the people who will deal with palm oil technology, all sorts of people, to be ready to be of use when democracy is restored. In Malaysia, we have hundreds of Burmese people studying this, whatever we could give to Burma under our Malaysian Technical Cooperation Program. ASEAN as a whole and individually will continue to convince Burma to speed up reforms. ASEAN hopes that Burma will eventually become a member of ASEAN. But for now, this is precluded. We want to see Burma move on democracy before we can accept Burma as a member of ASEAN. Future relations with Burma will be governed by progress and direction in the political and economic reforms. ASEAN do not want Burma to hide behind or use ASEAN in trying to redeem its image. We are quite embarrassed, as I said earlier, about the efforts of the Burmese authorities to try to get us to accept them and use us as a pointer to positive developments in Burma. This we are not very happy about. The general impression among ASEAN countries is that SLOC will continue to govern for the next 5 years, attempting to gain acceptance from the region more and more, not on the basis of legitimacy, but on the basis of stability. This will have a high cost in terms of human rights. And also, there will be a vacuum because of the continued stranglehold of the military authorities on the Burmese population. And in our estimation, there are no cracks in the military setup. And there will be no impending serious splits. General Kin Yoon is the man to watch. He wields the power beyond his official status, besides being the intelligence chief. We are told that General Kin Yoon is known to be receptive to calls for reforms, and that he was instrumental in beginning the dialogue with Suu Kyi. There is information from observers in Rangoon that SLOC may agree to general elections in 2 years. ASEAN countries hold the view that SLOC cannot, in the long run, stand against the upsurge of diplomatic demands set free in 1988 and the elections of 1990. political liberalization undergone in the neighboring countries, Philippines, Korea, and elsewhere, will add to the impetus for change. And we believe that the isolation of Burma of the 60s, which was so hermetically sealed, the situation is not the same now, even if Burma tries to go inward looking, because of modern media factor and because of economic reforms and its compulsions. To conclude, the Burmese authorities are seen to have taken a few positive steps, albeit tentative and inadequate, but they must be encouraged and pressured to do more. SLOC, it is said, can be made to accept changes, but not as a result of external pressure, this being a Burmese trait. The role of ASEAN countries and others in the region helps in further moving the process. ASEAN countries have to do more, interacting with Burma, balancing incentives and disincentives. ASEAN countries have to be conscious in not toning down their efforts on reforms on the basis of what they're doing economically in Burma. We have to make the point as ASEAN countries that market reforms are no substitute for actions to institute democracy, human rights, equity, and social justice. The role of the UN, we have to maximize the dialogue between the Secretary General and SLOC. The Special Rapporteur, whose job is to look at specific allegations of violations of human rights, will have to do more than what he's doing now. He has to be courageous in coming to conclusions and recommendations. At the same time, international pressure as it's directed and the UN will have to continue, and the denial of international development assistance would also be expected to continue. SLOC understands that the country cannot open up and modernize without external assistance. It has to recognize the critical role of foreign assistance to Burma's future economy. SLOC needs the United States to unlock Japanese assistance, along with the credit and loans from multilateral international institutions. SLOC may well, in our estimation, allow for more room for Aung San Suu Kyi, perhaps even release her with certain restrictions. In a sense, you have developed or developing a kind of mutual dependence. The military needs Aung San Suu Kyi if the country is to get out of decades of economic stagnation and political isolation. And Aung San Suu Kyi needs the military if she is to get her freedom and to bring and restore democracy for Burma. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions. On the rim of your tables, facing you on the inside, there are white buttons. And when you ask a question, you need to hold on pushing in on that white button so that the audio system picks it up and so everyone else can hear you. As with all of the forum events by the Institute of Politics, we encourage you to ask questions, and so that as many people can be included as possible, not to make statements, but keep it to questions. Yes, Professor Pai.
Ambassador Razali, your point at the end, although it was very challenging, I thought you came at a very scholarly academic point, maybe not a diplomatic point. That is, you seem to suggest that it is going to be possible to work something out. Aung San Suu Kyi and the military somehow need each other. I wonder about this. I wonder whether this is a likely reality. In the sense that we do feel that something is happening in Burma. Something is giving. Something is likely to be happening. I don't know why the State Department decided to have its a study of Burma, but there wasn't some feeling of this. There's a feeling that meetings with Aung San Suu Kyi, the points that you made too, that something is giving. What I wonder, though, is how much of this is based on an idea that maybe Burma could go the route of Deng Xiaoping's China, i.e. economic liberalization opening up, but maybe political constraints. If that is behind the thought, I question it in the sense that it seems to me that what Burma has that China does not have and the other countries did not have, is they have Aung San Suu Kyi, they have a tradition of democracy, they had an election which was overwhelmingly opposed to military. Therefore, I don't see how you could work out such a comfortable relationship. It seems to me that there is an issue here that has to be more directly confronted. And it seems that I wonder if we want to be optimistic, there are signs of optimism, but doesn't there have to be a real, in the end, a real decision?
I think the question is directed to
I
Tom.
guess it's you, but I'd happy to have
But
the Secretary
I
answer.
jump into this to answer first because I want you to answer the bigger question. But I would like to perhaps direct your attention to the situation in Pakistan. When you have a comparative situation, you had a comparative situation. The daughter of a great nationalist, she was in jail. The father was hanged, killed, and now she's Prime Minister of Pakistan. The modus vivendi having been worked out between the military and Benazir Bhutto. You could well be right, you could go the way of China, but in ASEAN, we're trying to work on a certain basis. If we believe that Burma is going to go to the way of China, then obviously we have to change our scenario completely. Yeah. At the moment, we still are predicating our efforts on the basis of moderating Burma, influencing Burma, to see that you are not unique. It has happened before, and you have to come back to the fold, and there are ways of doing this. And this is the basis we're working on now.
I think Sri Razali is correct in saying that the SLORC realizes that it needs the world and somehow sees the United States as the key to the world. One of the things he said to me, in fact, was that Ken Yunt said to me was that we can feed and clothe our own people, but we can't progress without access to international finance and without access to modern technology. We wish we could find a way to convince you to get out of the way. I think, in fact, Burma is different from China. It's different in part because of the presence of Aung San Suu Kyi, in part because of a tradition that has existed there and continues to live on despite tremendous vicissitudes for the last 40 years or so. I think the SLORC realizes it needs the world, realizes that Aung San Suu Kyi, or at least what she symbolizes and represents, is the key to access to the world. What remains quite unclear to me is how far they're prepared to go in the direction that they need to take to bring the world in. As I mentioned, I sensed a lot more concern about the internal security situation, about dealing with the various ethnic groups, a lot more concern about that than I did about what we see as gross violations of human rights and what we see as the stifling of democracy. And I hope it doesn't take 5 years to bring about positive change, whatever the engine may be.
My question is for Councillor Razali and Mr. Hubbard. As you probably know, two oil companies, French Total and Unocal, which is based in Los Angeles, plan to build a pipeline from the offshore Yadana field to Thailand. In the process of Unocal's operations in Burma, they've provided $25 million in hard currency in payment for goods, services, and exploration fees. The pipeline they plan to build through Mon and Karen-occupied territory has been planned without any kind of consultation with representatives of the Mon and the Karen peoples. And the plan is to sell the gas for cash to Thailand, which would provide windfall revenues for the SLORC through the profit-sharing contract, whilst not building any kind of infrastructure, economic infrastructure inside Burma. My question is, there's been some talk over how economic sanctions might hurt the Burmese people, but it seems in the case of this development, this is a case where economic development seems to be hurting the Burmese people, particularly the minorities. And I would like to ask both Councillor Razali and Mr. Hubbard whether there are any measures they think that should be taken to mitigate or prevent projects of this kind in Burma at this present time.
Let me try to go first this time. Burma is one of the few countries in the world where the United States neither encourages nor discourages investment or trade. Any instinct we might have to try to discourage investment and trade really comes up against the problem of not being able to organize a multilateral boycott. That any effort to prevent, say, Unocal from participating in this project would, I think, only lead to some other firm from some other country becoming involved. We also don't think that an economic boycott would in the long run benefit the Burmese people. What we do when representatives of Unocal or any other company come in to see us is we recommend that they carefully study the situation, that they consult with all parties who might be affected by the investment, that they be aware of such things as forced labor, forced porterage, other violations of international norms that occur in Burma, and they try to avoid that. In other words, we urge them to be good, responsible corporate citizens. We think it would be futile to try to organize a broad multilateral boycott of Burma at this stage.
This matter is known in the UN, and it is being looked at from the point of view of the effect it will have. This project will have on the environment. So I think that it is some effort it would be mounted now to try to discourage this project from going on environmentally. I think these companies can be traced through their governments, and I'm sure if from the point of view of the environmental angle, you would be able to influence or at least try to discourage or reduce the kind of the size and extent of this project.
Yes, in the back.
There's obviously some necessary ambiguity to the situation, but there's some ambiguity in my mind that I'd like to see if Mr. Hubbard could clear up. My understanding was that the delegation went to Burma to speak with SLORC with a kind of a two-pronged option presented to the SLORC government. Either you change, or there is going to be a more severe posture from the United States government. That is to say, something moving towards sanctions of some sort. And that depending on which article you read, whether it's in the Washington Post or in the New York Times, or if you talk to Morton Halperin, I mean, different people say different things about what happened. Let's say that one version is that there is some willingness to change on the part of the SLORC, and therefore there has been a kind of a softening of the U.S. position or the U.S. stance, or a kind of an openness in that direction, that the United States is looking sort of has an expectant view of the way things are going. Is that correct? And if it's also correct that you will be looking to Aung San Suu Kyi to be the principal indicator of whether there is satisfactory change, in at least one article, there was a suggestion that she had, based on having had 2 meetings, indicated that there was somehow satisfactory movement or progress. So is that correct to your knowledge? Is there any? Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yes, you can read lots of things in many newspapers, and in fact, sometimes you can read two different things on the editorial page of the same newspaper. 2 weeks ago, the New York Times carried an editorial that was high in its praise of us for going there with our two-pronged message and standing up to the slork, and then on Thanksgiving Day, they greeted us with an editorial taking entirely the reverse position. Those two editorials, I think, were written by the same person and based on the same visit, so it's a little hard to understand what they're trying to get across. I think it is difficult to describe and explain politically how dialogue can further national interests. One of the other things I've been doing that has, in fact, occupied most of my time for the last year and a half has been negotiating with North Korea. It took a long time to even get people within the government to realize that somehow you can stand up to a tough regime and make some progress through talking, that talking works better than isolation, particularly when it's when you can't really isolate another country. So the purpose of the trip had been planned for some time. The policy study was actually drafted nearly a year ago. In fact, Deirdre Chedham, who's here at Harvard as a student or a fellow or something right now, was one of the principal authors of that when she was the Burma desk officer in the State Department. Ironically, one of the reasons we didn't take the trip earlier is because I was tied up with North Korea so long. In fact, you might have noticed that my trip followed by about 5 days conclusion of the talks in Geneva. So it was not based on anything positive we had seen. Rather, the idea of a delegation, of an envoy, was based on the thought that for 6 years we've tried to bring about change in Burma without talking to them. We've had only limited success, if any, on that course, so let's try talking to them and present our strong views more directly and face-to-face and see if that works better. I haven't drawn any conclusions yet from the visit other than those I outlined here. I came to the conclusion that the United States matters to Burma. I left Burma thinking the United States matters more to Burma than I thought when I went there. I believe they do see the United States as a key to the outside world, and now, and I think this is a positive trend, the Burmese regime thinks the outside world is important, unlike some of the predecessors. There's been 2 sets of talks with Aung San Suu Kyi. We were assured that they would continue. We certainly hope they will. We'll be looking to see what happens. No, I think the conciliatory posture that was written about in one of the later New York Times articles was simply a headline writer's fancy. In fact, it was the same visit, and we went in with a firm position and a great deal of skepticism and left with both still intact.
Is there a danger that a signal has been given by statements of the futility of moving towards sanctions if there can be no consensus among Asian neighbors, that in effect a signal is being given that they needn't worry about a tougher stance from the U.S.?
Actually, I tried to add on to my statement to that effect that we think it would be futile at the present time, and we are not advocating strengthening sanctions against Burma right now. We went in and said, if things improve, you can expect warmer relations. If they don't improve, you can expect the reverse, and we think we ought to give them a little time to produce before we make a decision on that.
I have a question, bringing it back to Cambridge. Harvard Institute for International Development works with governments, has since the early 50s, giving technical assistance on food policy, health policy, macroeconomic planning commissions. If HID was thinking of working in Burma, what would your advice be, each of you? Should an institute within a university work in technical assistance, and then this usually involves coming back and doing more research and teaching about the issues you learn about during the technical assistance? What would you suggest?
Our position at the moment, I think, would again be to neither encourage nor discourage right now. We want you to consider very carefully who you're working with, where you're doing the work, how it might contribute to bettering welfare there, how it might impact on the SLORC and its recognition in the world. What I'm saying within the government is that you might imagine that there's considerable pressure to step up counter-narcotics cooperation, given Burma's role in the heroin problem we have in the United States. My recommendation within the government is just what I said. We went in with a dual message. With progress, we can improve relations. Without progress, we can't. And let's give them a little while and see what happens before we talk about expanding the presence of Americans and American institutions there.
Mr. Razali?
Me?
Yeah. What advice would you give the
Well,
university?
I'm an activist. I believe in being catalytic. I believe that you should go and do it. I think you should, in a case like this, you should establish as many lifelines as possible to the Burmese people.
May I say one thing, though? If you excuse me one minute.
Of course.
I think Harvard will be very unpopular with the people if you go in now. Because I'm defending Harvard now. I wish Hubbard would remain for a while before we get in.
AA, yes.
Yeah. My also
Can you
feeling
push?
is that right now,
Push them. You have to hold it.
if you go in, did I? If you go in, we should not just go in and leave it, to the slog, to do whatever they want to do it. I mean, we should go in with some kind of a strings attached. Okay, if you do this and this and this, we will give you this and this and this. Or also at the same time, it should go into the grassroots of the people, not to slog, because there are very many incidents that. For instance, UNICEF would go in and give all these medical facilities and everything, and say that rather than giving to the slog, they said, okay, we'll go and give it to the hospitals directly, so that the patients and the people will get it. They went in and gave all these medical facilities to the hospitals, but the next days they were all out from the back door and to the front line, to the military, rather than to the people. So this is what is happening there. I mean, with all my heart, I want the people to get all the benefits. I don't want them to be denied or anything. But at the same time, I know for very sure that people are not getting it. This is what does worry us, and this is what is the problem now. So, if whoever goes in, but just to be sure that this gets into the people's hand, not to the slog.
It's 6:30, and I'm afraid we're going to have to end the formal part. Our speakers will be here for a short while. For those of you who would like to come up and informally speak with them and meet them, I thank you all for attending. I hope this is the first of many seminars we will have on Burma, and I hope that we will all stay engaged with this very compelling country. Thank you.
Survive that, right?
Yes, we make it through it.